stream that we had available, and so anything that we were looking at, we were looking at expenditure patterns or prior results, understanding that that's what our district is doing, but that may not be getting us to the question of what do we need to be doing to making sure our students are adequately funded or adequately supported. This was really based on what we were doing in prior times under our FTE model. And with that, we came into two key concepts that we used to develop our model. Again, really reinforcing this idea that whatever revenue that we started with, at the end, if we changed the revenue, we had to have the same amount of money. So we didn't have any additional money to basically dump into a new system to change funding. So really what that means is, in a weighted model, anytime that you add a weight or change or focus dollars to under those constraints, anytime you add a weight, you have to reduce the base to accommodate that weight. Now that's what we did under the constraints that we were dealing with as a local district. I think as we talk about potential other models at the state level, I don't know that that's a constraint that I think needs to be questioned. Then we moved in with the basic key backgrounds on how we were going to design our model. We moved into an implementation phase, and similar to what we heard on the previous discussion, we focused heavily on school principals and assistant principals in this process, because ultimately they were going to be the ones that were managing the resources that were going to be allocated out to them. And one of the things that we really were cognizant of during that process is to ask them, what resources do you want to manage, and what resources do you feel aren't within your realm, or that you don't have a whole lot of impact on the instructional environment if you were to try to manage those. We also did get perspectives from community members and teachers at this time, because this was a fairly big shift for us in our school district. That implementation team began to work with the pilot model and really started looking at different weights that we might use in our model. We'll see those later in the presentation. But again, really focusing on this idea that we really needed to provide support to the folks that were going to be using this model. So you can see here we developed a step-by-step methodology for schools to follow. What that meant is we needed to understand where school principals would need training, what kind of supports they might need to understand what resources they're getting and how they might use those resources. And then we also had to do a lot of communication along this way, so that people understood, what are we talking about? This is fairly significantly different from how we had allocated resources in the past. And as we move forward to the implementation phase, there were a number of items that we raised as concerns going into this model. Because we were holding to this concept of the pie, or the revenue stream does not change or is held constant, anytime you change an allocation like that, you're going to create schools that are getting more resource and schools that are not. And if you don't find that, I guess the question would be, why make the change? If there was no change and everything was just as it was before, then that would indicate that the FT model was serving you fine. So what we did find that there were situations where schools would be receiving fewer dollars that they did in the past, and we had identified some one-time money in the budget from fund balance that would basically soften that change over the course of 2 years, I believe we did, to help schools kind of grow into the idea that there's going to be some changes based on this new model. And the other component, as I mentioned this before, was SBB implementation during a grade reconfiguration. Oh, we're going to run out of power here in a second. Means I got to hustle. And so one of the big tests, I think, for our model was with the dollars following the students, there was a lot of apprehension of, okay, we're also talking about reconfiguring our grades at the same time. And so there was a lot of concern that the SBB model would not be able to handle that. And I think an indication that the work was done well was that it did handle the change fairly well, and the fact that we were moving 2 whole grades, different levels, and we really didn't need to change the model at all because of that, because the dollars did follow the students when that happened. So now what I want to do is just introduce you to our formula, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this because I know you know a lot about this, but the weighted formula really is focusing on getting dollars out to the schools, and it's primarily based on enrollment, but it also, hence the word weighted formula, starts to allocate additional resources out to for specific student populations. And what you see here is our current formula, and we've targeted basically 3 student characteristics that are funded in our formula: gifted and talented, ELL, at risk, and in our formula, at risk is the same proxy as the state, where we use free lunch on that count. And then for any of the gifted, ELL, and at risk, the way our model works, and this can be done multiple different ways, this is just the way we chose to do it, is that a student only gets the dominant factor, so they don't get a cumulative impact. So if I'm gifted and talented and at risk or on free lunch, I wouldn't get 30%. I only get the dominant factor. So when we did our work, we realized that that ELL and at risk, if you had both of those characteristics, we wanted to provide additional resource, so that became a dominant weight at that point. We also fund grades K through 3, where we get additional resources out to the primary grades. And this was really in response to one of our previous override elections, where the voters had authorized us to spend more money in the primary grades, and so we were able to put a factor in there to make sure that that stayed consistent. One of the questions I get often is, where did you come up with the weights? And the honest answer is, well, I don't have any hard research to tell you about that. What we did do, and what I worry about doing on a grander scale, but again, operating within this confound of you've got only X amount of dollars to spend, we really relied heavily on what was our old FTE model doing, and tried to align weights to mimic to some extent what the FTE model was doing, but at the same time get those inconsistencies out of the system. And so that's exactly what you're seeing here, is that we were mimicking to some extent what we were already doing, while providing some additional resource, I would say, to the ELL and at-risk factors, but not a whole lot, because any additional weights that we added there, given the rules that we set up, would take away from the base, and that seemed to detrimentally impact more schools as we did that. We actually had some models that were running side by side. What was the FTE model yielding in converting those into dollars, and then what the new formula would yield. And so we were really watching that closely to make sure that we weren't getting any spikes in places that we did not want those, but at the same time getting some consistency in how that resource is allocated out. One of the things that our model has, of which is something that we've used for a while now, is a small school or a size adjustment within our model. And simply put, what we're doing here is we're adjusting for economies of scale, and that's based on some work that we did within the district. We also have a geographic or mountain schools factor, and I always, whenever I give this presentation locally, I always say that's a size factor that we actually can put a name on. I mentioned that we actually work up or all the way up to the Wyoming border, and we've got 3 very isolated elementary schools out in the Red Feather Lakes area, Stove Prairie, up in the mountains, and these schools are extremely small. And what we did is we realized that to be able to support the programs that we felt were adequate for those, or not adequate, but at least at the level that was provided before, we would need to provide an 80% adjustment for those schools at that point. So that was something. These are really size adjustments, and I always call them school components because they're based on the school characteristic and not necessarily the student characteristic. When we look at what resources are allocated, and this is where a lot of people kind of look at me sideways a little bit when I start laying out what are we doing. Keep in mind, we really asked our principals, what do you want to manage and what do you not want to manage? Now, is that the same answer from every principal? Absolutely not. There's some principals in our school district that would love to manage everything. There's some that would rather not manage a whole lot. But on the most part, most of our principals said we would really like to have control over how we use licensed staff within our building, how we use our school-based classified employees, and you'll notice that I don't have like custodial or any of those type of positions. This is really kind of the front office and paraprofessional support and folks that might be working in media centers, and they want to manage their school budgets. And so our allocation really focuses on providing those resources out to the schools, and there's a whole host of other items that are taking place within the district that that at this point we've decided that's not something that we want to allocate out through student-based budgeting. That's not to say that it can't be done at a later date, but this is where we landed with our implementation year, and we have not changed this. So you can see a whole list, and I'm not going to read the list off for you, but there's a whole lot of items that that the schools have chosen not to manage at the site level, and to let the district manage those. So one of the pieces I think that's confusing for folks is somebody's going to ask me the question, how much of your budget are you allocating out through student-based budgeting? When we look at these resources, the honest answer is, once we peel the charter schools allocation out, about 50% of the budget is being allocated out through student-based budgeting. But don't confuse that with how much of your instructional budget is being allocated out or not, or what's going on within the building or not, because I think they're different answers. So as you can see in here, there are a large number of instructional expenditures that are still taking place. We're just choosing not to allocate them out through student-based budgeting. Some successes we had from the first year, schools really reported back that they had a greater understanding of resources. You heard the comment earlier of a school principal, what's your school budget? Well, it's my operating budget. Well, our principals don't think that anymore. For sure, they understand the magnitude of the budgets that they're dealing with, and they're fairly large for a principal to deal with, and they did appreciate the flexibility of the staffing process. So what this does is that it basically says you're going to be able to make some of those decisions at the site level as to how you're going to utilize that resource, and they also really like the effectiveness of being able to rapidly explain to not only their staff, but people that might be in their school accountability committees and just the community at large, what is my budget and how am I using it as far as the SBB allocation, because it really is pretty simple once you get it broken down. Some modifications, and this slide's very busy, so I'm just going to gloss over it a little bit. There's really two things that we modified since implementation, and we haven't modified a whole lot since. And I think one of the primary reasons why we didn't change a whole lot is we're obviously dealing with the same challenges that all the other school districts are in Colorado in decreasing budgets. And so it's awfully hard to add dollars to weights when we're trying to reduce budgets at the same time. So we haven't changed a whole lot, other than the fact that one of the changes we did make is we do an adjustment mid-year based on the October count. So schools basically are very active in their projection methodology of what students they might have the next year. But what we do is we call it October true-up, is once the October count is finalized, we rerun the formula, and then we tell schools either you're going to get some more resource based on what that count was, or you're going to need to return some funds because you didn't meet the projection that we mutually agreed to. That makes a lot of people very nervous, and I'll tell you that it still is something that we work through in our district. Although I can tell you over time our principals have gotten a lot better at being more reasonable with what their projections were. Almost to the point, and maybe on the last bullet, inspires conservative budget planning at the school level. I'm actually working with schools to not be overly conservative now because they're really worried about that October true-up. They'd much rather get a check in December and not have to pay back, and I don't blame them on that. But schools are encouraged to maintain a reserve of their own to manage these fluctuations. So again, we're pushing, you're seeing a reoccurring theme here. we're actually having the schools be more responsible for the budget that's allocated to them. And so they are expected to at least begin the year with a 3% reserve that would help them absorb some of those fluctuations as they may occur. And the other component that I don't have on the slide here is if a school does not utilize all the dollars in a year, we do not sweep it back to the district. The school retains those funds so that they can maintain a reserve to basically do multi-year planning. The second modification that we made to our formula is to really take a closer look at size. And so we did a year-long study, and I can probably provide that study if folks would be interested in seeing it. But what we did is internally, we found that there were incremental changes in size or in cost as size got lower. And how we came about that is we basically used some professional judgment panel members within our district, namely principals and teachers, and we had them build prototypical models of different size schools, and we costed those out and said, okay, how does cost change as size gets smaller? A lot of the costs are variable or are to some extent variable, but we found some interesting things that our panel pointed out that for example, an office manager position, you may say, well, that should be a variable cost, but what our panels found was for a safety reason, we needed to have somebody monitoring the front desk and seeing people coming in and out of the building, regardless of whether we had 250 students or 600 students in that building. That was a critical role, so that became a fixed cost. So as enrollment got lower, that cost did creep up incrementally. We had some characteristic of that within specials, for art, music, and PE, but there was also some variable characteristic to that too. So our study really defined a J curve within our own district to help us deal with size, because it was one place where our SBB formula was just not addressing the needs of our schools. Continued challenges that we have within the SBB model is often as you give more site-based decision making to the site, those aren't necessarily aligned with expectations of all stakeholder groups. No surprise there for folks in the room. But one of the challenges I think we really had is as we were looking at making reductions in budgets, schools, one of the reductions we made in response to state reductions 3 years ago was to reduce our base funding, and by formula that actually played out into all the factors and everything by 4.5%. So we reduced our funding going out to schools by 4.5%, and sites started making decisions around, do I want to maintain my class size or do I want to reduce specials? And there was probably 100 different scenarios that could play out in that. And not everybody agreed with those decisions that were being made. So that was a challenge I think that we continue to have, is giving that control to the building to make decisions around where do I want my class size, or how do I want the instructional model delivered, is going to vary from site to site. I get calls from community members all the time, what's your class size? And they're often surprised when I respond to, well, it depends, because it really does depend on what site decisions are being made out there, and some sites may be choosing to have small class size. Some may be delivering the instructional model in a different way that doesn't address class size to that extent. So that's a challenge for us. And the level of input into the budget process is something we're continuing to work on within Pooter. Not all sites have a large vested input in budget. So some schools, I'll give you an example. I've got one school in Pooter where I have attended their school accountability committee teams, and there's 30 people in the room with me. There's other schools where I think they're hard pressed to get 5 sometimes. So this is a big challenge, and it does put a lot of pressure on the principal or that team when they're making decisions in both situations, I think. So that's a challenge as to what level of input you're getting at the site that we continue with. And other challenges, as we talked about quite a bit last time, federal and state requirements sometimes just don't fit within a weighted model. or maybe not obviously to me yet. Maybe that's yet to be determined. But we have real challenges. As you may have noticed, we do not have special education as a weighted allocation. We feel that we're best suited to allocate that out as a central program and not allocate that out at the building level. And probably one of the last components of a challenge that I want to share with the group today is alignment of resources. And this really gets into one thing that really concerns me as we talk about student-weighted formulas, and I have this conversation locally all the time, is, okay, you're allocating these dollars out, and it's pretty easy to see in the formula, you're getting X amount of dollars for gifted and talented students. So show me a report that tells me what your gifted and talented expenditures are at that site. Where I get concerned about that is sometimes easy to get at, and sometimes it's all next to impossible. The example I use here is gifted and talented. If we have a contract where we have, let's say, a 20% teacher that is focused on gifted and talented, that's an easy number for us to grab out of the financial system and account for. But if it's something that's integrated into the overall instructional design, all of a sudden it gets to be very complicated to say how are we going to get what that percentage is as teachers are spending time on those concepts. So that's a challenge. I don't have an answer for that one. I just think that's something that struck me as we talked at the last meeting too. So that's all I had to share with you. Again, this is an example of what Pooter has done locally based on what we were trying to do was really get at transparency and equity, and really have something that was explainable to our community and explainable to our schools, and I think it accomplishes that. But as I said in my opening comments, or kind of midstream there, be careful, because what we've done is based on our local characteristics and our unique school district, and that may or may not apply to other districts in the room or across the state.
That's great. Thanks, Dave. For both of our presenters. So what we're going to do now is take about a 10-minute break and reconvene. By my watch, it's about 10 till, so close to 4 o'clock. We'll let you stretch a little bit. We're going to kind of set up conversation spaces in here to work in a small group. And in how many rooms do we have across the way? We have 3 more. Great. So if you're kind of trapped in the middle of one, you may want to use some of the annex space, and we'll kind of guide you into some small group discussions to chew on some of these ideas. Hopefully our presenters won't mind if you grab them real quick with some follow-up questions. But we've found that there's a lot of resources within your small groups to answer some of these. So when you come back from the break, we'll get you into small groups. We'll have about 20 to 25 minutes in small group discussions. We'll pull back together for you to ask some large group insights, and then we'll have a chance to hear from you on some recommendations going forward. So let's be ready for small group discussions in about 10 minutes. So take a quick break. Maybe that group is just coming. Oh, Riley is the nominee for that one. Actually, it looks like we're still waiting for that group, perhaps. Oh, you're here? Is there anyone that was taking notes in that group? Oh, she was. She is apparently not here. How about let's skip to the April through June group. Is there anyone that was taking some notes that wouldn't mind sharing a few thoughts from that group? April through June. This is proving harder to find. Oh, okay. All right. So Ed, do you mind kicking us off, just because I know you're here, and we'll go in reverse order from the December through.
Thank you.
90 seconds summary. Oops.
90 seconds. A couple of the topics that members in our group raised. This is really about increasing the skills and capacity of principals.
I'm sorry, Ed, one second. If folks wouldn't mind giving your full attention, it's hard to pick up on the machine. It's also more polite. Thanks, Ed.
Increasing the capacity of principals, and one of the questions that came up in that regard was, how well do principals know their own schools? How well do they know budgeting? How well do they know the federal laws, especially around special education? Another comment, I think, that received a lot of nods when this was made: school-based carryover is important, allowing schools to save the money and bank any unspent money at the end of the fiscal year. Equity, adequacy, and equality. These are very different, but sometimes those issues are used interchangeably, so we need to be very careful about those definitions. The power of transparency. Certainly all the districts are implementing the transparency bill that was passed 2 or 3 years ago, but now are we going to move that down to a school level? Most of today's discussion was about systems management, but adequacy of funding was important, is important to remember as well. Finally, our final comment, which will be my final comment, if you have a limited amount of funding and a limited amount of political will, is the student-based budgeting the most important issue to address? Maybe we need a fair allocation formula at the district level first so people would have confidence in that. So I would turn to the October through December group and see if there's anything else that I missed out.
Key themes. Welcome.
Turn it back to you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
How about back to the top, January through March? Is there any representative from that? Is that Riley? Yeah. Did you get volunteered to be the spokesperson too?
I did.
Excellent.
I think. I'm happy to hand this off to anyone else that wants it, though. So we had some good, robust conversation, and it started out by saying, and I missed the other comment, so if this has already been said, my apologies, but that in Colorado, the size factor really does matter. When we have around 100 districts of our 178 that have less than 100 students, you start getting into some, what? I just took the information and made it fact, so that's great. So starting to look at what are fixed costs and how do you manage around those. There were questions, especially for Marguerite, around student outcomes, and do you have information that could highlight where student-based budgeting has really driven outcomes in different places across the country, and were there examples that we could look to either through Pooter or other places where this was helping to drive stronger student outcomes, particularly for our most vulnerable kids? And then what else am I missing from, there was a lot of discussion and it was centered around these main points. Vinny had some great points. Sorry to call you out, Vinny. I don't know where you are. There we go. But really talking about using charters as a model and as an example where you have large charter networks, you have small charter networks, you have rural, urban, and this budgeting has to work for them. And so is there a way to look at either models like CSI or the BOCES and tweak those so that they can be successful and helpful with the financing, as well as with trying to alleviate some of the barriers that we see in terms of mandatory reporting and taking that off of small districts' hands so that they can really focus on allocating these dollars appropriately to drive student outcomes. And if current BOCES models aren't working, what can you do to tweak those to see student outcomes increase?
Thank you, Riley. How about the April through June group? Is there a spokesperson from that group? All right.
Hi, Paula Stevenson, Rural Caucus. Yes, I was volunteered. Some of the things I say might overlap because I walked in the middle of one of the discussions, but we talked about the fact that what Pooter's doing is interesting, and a lot of the research that was provided was interesting, but there's no information tying it to student achievement. So there's a discussion about where those results are, and if it's not increasing student achievement, why are we being asked to do it? Maybe changes should be tied to the things we're already being asked to do. There was a question about how does student-based budgeting apply to rural schools? And what's the effect of closing the school but leaving the kid in there for 3 years? It's got to be incredibly demoralizing, so that's something we need to really think about if that's the kind of model we're going to look at. And then this idea of fundraising our way out of the holes, we know that doesn't work. We kind of have that model in Colorado already. It's called gifts, grants, and donations. I can tell you it doesn't work in rural Colorado where we don't have resources. So that really doesn't apply. George Welsh, sorry to put you on the spot, started, I thought, in a great place of talking about some of the good ideas. And this idea that we're going to shift dollars to kids that need it most is great if we have an adequate base. And that's where we seem to have the rub. We need to ensure that the base and the special characteristics are adequate before we start rearranging the formula. There was a discussion about the school-based allocation ability to tap into local property wealth, where you can get more for your kids there. But again, in Colorado, we know we have a problem and that this isn't working, and it's something that we absolutely need to address. Another question was, how does school-based allocation work with SPED when we are underfunding it at such low levels? And when Pooter said they didn't put SPED into the school-based allocation. And then lastly, we had some comments about how does school-based allocation get dollars to teachers in high poverty areas? And when Will and I were talking, I changed it a little bit to say, how does school-based allocation level the playing field for teacher salaries across the state? Because it's not just high poverty areas. You can look at rural Colorado and our salaries are half of what they are in the urban areas. And that's a big issue for getting high quality teachers that will stay in our districts.
Thank you. And I think our last group was the July 3rd. Yeah.
July. I made the mistake of asking who was taking notes, so I won't do that again. I think that some of what we talked about was how do you take what works in a school district and apply it at the state and still make it work? And worries about taking the decision-making further and further away from the actual local conditions, which vary significantly between small and large districts and high poverty and those districts who can pass mill levies time and again. Districts already have the authority to do this work at the district level. We've seen that by David's presentation. And importantly, what is the intended outcome? Are we looking at improved student achievement, or are we looking at equity and fairness across districts, so intra-district as well as inter-district fairness? I think we see this happening in many ways already and are concerned about, though, some of those economies of scale that come with large districts or large programs. You might unfund a program that's already working because it doesn't fit in some box, and the concern about backing into the funding model in spite of what's working is a fear. I think one of the things that we talked about that was solutions-oriented was, is there a way that we can do this with added reporting and transparency that tracks the flow of money and shows the public, okay, here's how we're spending the money at the school level, at the student level, and have that pressure come from the public to make changes if necessary. There was an acknowledgement that some districts do not spend the money where it makes the most difference, where it makes the most bang for the buck. And then, in fact, there was a conversation at one point, we need to ensure there's flexibility in how this works, but someone was saying also maybe there's too much flexibility at times. We're using at-risk money, perhaps not for at-risk kids and that kind of thing. So there was an honest discussion, I think, in our room about, we're not doing it perfectly now. There are probably some ways we could make it better, but if you apply this at the state level, there's some real concerns.
Okay. Thanks, Bruce. So maybe there were some questions that popped out. Thanks, Bruce. For Marguerite and David around research around the effect on student achievement. Marguerite, if you could speak to that, and then some questions for you, Dave, about how it worked in a...
Sure. So this question comes up a lot. So what, if you change the allocation formula, what is the effect on student outcomes? And the allocation formula is more of a necessary precondition to doing other things. So you can't have accountability without an equitable allocation formula. You can't create incentives for the best behavior without an allocation formula that supports that. But there isn't a direct link between any allocation formula and student outcomes, in the sense that a child in 3rd grade says, now that the state has shifted to a new funding model, I finally know how to read. I mean, there are obviously a lot of steps in between the funding formula and the child's acquisition of knowledge and learning and those kinds of things. So that's difficult. Now, that said, most of the districts that are trying to make reforms, the funding formula stands in the way. So it's more about creating a funding formula that allows the flexibility for the customization of the kinds of programs that build on the talent of the staff in certain sites and the needs of the students. Oftentimes you have a rigid formula that's in the way of that. It says, nope, you got to use your money for X. And then they say, but what our students really need in this particular location is Y. And by the way, we don't need that X staff position because we have this other tremendous staff position that's actually doing many of those functions. And now you're going to make us